Hi, everybody. My name is Raffael Boccamazzo, better known as Dr. B. I am a doctor of clinical psychology, and I am the clinical director of Take This. And we are here today for this D&D Celebration 2020 to talk to you about how to build a fantastic story structure around a mental health theme. Now, we've been seeing mental health themes in media for, well, forever. But often it's done in a really stigmatizing or really stereotypical way that is largely untrue and not really reflective of authentic experiences. And so we brought this amazing collection of panelists here, and we are all going together build this live in front of you, maybe even with some of your input from the chat. So let's just start off with everybody introducing themselves. And you know what, Makenzie, you are on the top right of the screen, so you take it away.
Hi. Okay, hi, I'm Makenzie the Armas. My name on the overlay is spelled wrong, but that's okay. I am, you can find me over on Twitter at Makenzie Lane DA. I'm an independent tabletop game content creator. I'm the lead writer for The Islands of Sina Una, which is coming out soon. I also do stuff with MCDM, D&D Beyond, and Mage Hand Press. But most related to this panel, I am the author of the adventure on DM's Guild, I've Been, which is an adventure specifically geared towards talking about mental health and using game mechanics to experience and open up an avenue for open conversation about about that journey and how we not necessarily heal, but how we grow and learn to accept our own struggles. Thank you for having me. This is so exciting.
Well, thank you. Going down one further, Krystina.
Hello. Nice to meet. Well, nice to see you. I know everybody here, but people in the chat, nice to see you. My name is Krystina Arielle. I am an actor, tabletop entertainer, singer, and I am also a constant fighter of mental health. My mental illness and depression, and it is something that I've spent years working for and will continue to work at for the rest of my life. And I am here to help with the representation of people like me who are suffering.
Well, thank you, Krystina. We've got a little bit of technical issues on the back end that we're going to work on for hearing Krystina, because we know you have such wonderful, amazing things to say, and we want to hear everything you say. Going over to our left, Dr. Kelli Dunlap.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Kelli Dunlap. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I practice in Maryland. I'm also the community manager for Take This. And in my spare time, I teach game design at American University. That's where I got my master's in game design after my doctorate in psychology. So I'm over my schooling crutch, and I'm having a lot of fun working out with games, mental health, and the intersection of it everywhere in between.
Thank you, Dr. Kelli. And Gabe, take it away.
Hi, I'm Gabe James Games. I am a cosplayer, voice actor, and game designer for digital and tabletop games. When I heard about this, I was excited because I feel like generally, especially as a Black man, mental health is something that has been not given the perspective that I wish I had had as I was going through even just this past year. And I'm thankful for a lot of what I've gained out of it. And gaming, especially tabletop games like D&D, have helped me figure out ways to grasp and understand and manage it all.
Well, thank you, Gabe. And again, I'm Dr. Raffael Boccamazzo, better known as Dr. B. And one of the things I did not mention is I am one of the co-authors of the DM's Guild adventure Gardens of Fog, which is also a mental health themed adventure, which includes a new subclass for clerics based on Take This's mascot, the Psychomancer. But let's talk, gang, about building an actual adventure, because so many of you are writers, so many of you, everybody here has experience with games, whether it's video games or tabletop games. Typically speaking, let's use a 3-act structure. We break this down into 3 acts, and this is something I borrowed. This whole structure of what we're doing today, I'm borrowing from Satine Phoenix, who was kind enough to give her blessing on letting us do this. So typically, a story is divided into 3 acts. The first act is where we're introduced to our heroes. They have some sort of inciting incident that hooks us into the story, and then they set out on an adventure where we get to Act 2, where they have this series of escalating failures and successes until it comes to a climactic moment where Act 3, everything seems lost because they've swung their biggest swing, they've shot their shot, and it's failed. And finally, we have this resolution. Everything gets tied together, but we want to build that around some sort of mental health theme today. And this theme, what do we have any ideas? Maybe it can be loss, maybe it can be grief. Gabe, you are just at the ready.
Well, the first thing I was thinking of is depression, because it manifests in a bunch of different ways. The way that it affects people can be entirely different, and seeing it in someone does not mean you can see it in somebody else.
Okay.
And I can think of mechanics that from D&D that legitimately relate to that. Like, in the first one that came to mind is literally exhaustion.
Okay, exhaustion. So not just exhaustion of the body, but when we're dealing with depression, we're dealing with almost an exhaustion of the soul.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a heck of a theme. So like physical, emotional, mental exhaustion.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, I like that. Anybody else? Any other ideas? Krystina, y'all can shout this out. I feel like we're in class right now.
I got to kind of piggyback with Gabe and how this will show themselves. It's how do you deal long rest doesn't work. Like, what do you do? You're on quest to be a, and I think I kind of mentioned earlier, like beginning with this battle, but then we don't really kind of examine the after effects of the battle, and like how that can manifest in depression in our heroes, and how that can manifest in rage and fits of misunderstanding, and can break these people apart because the cries for help are just being heard as cries. That makes sense.
Okay. So we're talking about not just the sort of emotional exhaustion and that sort of physical exhaustion, that exhaustion of the soul that we have going on that can accompany things like depression, or even, there's other things too, like bereavement, extreme loss. You're talking about sort of the emotional ups and downs that can come with that, the reactivity.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So we got okay, any more ideas on this?
I mean, I guess mine ties into both, actually. I'm always a big fan of grief, which is a weird thing to say, but especially in our current time, grief being more than the loss of life, but rather, the loss of normal, the loss of connection, the loss of family, the loss of the way things used to be, and the ball in the box analogy for grief, I think, is a very powerful way of kind of conveying that through gameplay and storytelling.
Okay. So grief is not just necessarily the loss of a person or a thing, but the loss of routines, the loss of expectations.
Yeah, the loss of normal.
Loss of normal. Okay. All right. Well, those are, yeah, y'all are just digging in deep real quick on this. This is great. So we come right out the gate with exhaustion of the soul. So now the question is, how are we going to represent that in a playable context? How does this idea of both a sort of loss of normalcy, exhaustion of the soul, and even the unpredictability of swirlings of emotions, how can we make that something playable? What kind of quest?
So I think something that popped up is like when you think of like the horsemen of the apocalypse, but something instead, the manifestations of the soul, but like the hardest parts to handle it. And their presence causes these things to erupt and be enhanced and be harder to deal with. So the adventuring party has to physically overcome these horrible things and defeat them. And it doesn't mean it's going to be an easy fight, but it's a fight that they have to do.
Okay. So we make physical manifestations of some of these things, and we've seen that throughout literature. And I know Makenzie did this in her adventure that she mentioned. I've been. How did you do that in that, Makenzie?
So when I wanted to tackle, I tackled specifically, it was my experiences with depression and anxiety, and a lot of the cyclical cycle of how it feels, where you think you overcome it, and then you're like, yay, it's great, and then it comes back, and you're like, no, depression is back again. And that's something that we don't often talk about, especially in the context of D&D. When we defeat a monster, we always think, okay, it's done. We did it. The battle is over. We won. We can go celebrate now. And it never, we forget that it's not that simple in real life. And so when I wanted to create the encounters and the monsters and I've been, they were things that could come back later. They had effects that, similar to exhaustion, imposed like disadvantage or made certain tasks much more difficult in game. And you could overcome them, but there was always a chance that you might fall back. And it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but it was just sort of that perpetual, never quite goes away. You just learn how to deal with it. And that's something really interesting. I think also when you're starting out in an adventure that deals with mental health, you have to figure out whether, for the player characters at the center of this adventure, do we want this to be a vehicle for the player characters and thus the players to encounter and confront and talk about mental health, or is this a way to provide catharsis or experience helping another person and learning how to talk friends and create a community that can assist with that? Both are extremely valid ways of doing it, but they have very different avenues in terms of gameplay.
So how do we want to do that with this game? So we've got now 48 minutes to craft the structure of a full 3-hour adventure. How do we want to do this? Do we want to create this like some sort of catharsis, like Makenzie said? Do we want to teach? What do we want to do with this when we have so many of these themes swirling?
I like the idea of allowing the players to teach each other almost. Like figuring out how if someone has an idea of how to handle a tough situation inside of the game, it might be something that the player, when they see someone else's character manage it, approach it, consider that makes sense. That's a good idea. And I like that Makenzie was talking about, like, it's not just a final battle. So what if the party is dealing with the remnants of something, and that's what they're resolving. That's how they're helping people, looking to help people.
So they're looking to help people, remnants. Boy, there's all sorts of possibilities within Dungeons and Dragons for that, isn't there?
Yeah.
It makes me think of Power Rangers, which I promise will make sense. After the big battle, the city's destroyed. Like, who rebuilds the city? Who are the sanitation workers who are cleaning up all that mess? I've always wondered. But I don't think I've ever been on an adventure like that, where the big battle's already happened and the journey is really about, well, what comes next? And I think that can lend itself to a sense of resiliency, which is something important if you are, combating that depression monster over and over and over again, is finding ways to like push through even when you feel like you can't, and not when there's like the big rallying cry, but kind of the quiet after when all the help has gone.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's an interesting idea. What do you think about that as the beginning of the adventure is the end of another adventure? That our heroes are coming in after the battle, after the major baddie has been vanquished. What do we think about that?
I like that.
So who Okay. So a ruined town. So is that where our heroes begin this? Sort of, they encounter a ruined town.
I like it.
Okay.
I like that a lot, yeah.
Okay. Do we know what has recently ruined the town?
I would pose, do we need to know?
Yeah, I think leaving it open, if we give them a suggestion of something terrible, tragic, and harsh, then it'll give the DM a chance to insert something that the players can relate to. But then also it's open enough that we don't have to say, they can add their extra flavor to it that they like.
And it also would ensure the safety of players around the table, because when a great calamity happens, there are certain things that real life people, real life players, they don't want to necessarily deal with in game. They don't want to deal with, maybe they don't want to deal with war. Maybe that's a little too close to home. And so leaving what happens and what this kind of tragedy is that they have to confront, it allows them to engage in it in a safe way, engage in things they want to engage with and explore and achieve catharsis without overstepping any boundaries and creating a basically making sure it's a good catharsis and it doesn't end up inadvertently hurting anyone around the table.
No, this is fantastic. I like that, and that's a very, that's something we're hearing more and more of, thankfully, within the community for tabletop. The idea that being conscientious of the needs and limitations of the players, because many players are fighting their own invisible battles within that maybe they don't want to make public. So I like the flexibility of this. This is fantastic, gang. So that being said, so now our heroes, they come to a ruined town. This is the introduction. So next, after we have the introduction, we have to have the hook, the inciting incident that brings us into the adventure, that makes us want to play, that raises the stakes, that brings us tension. What's it going to be? The town's already ruined.
Yep. Can confirm.
Is
How
there
do you
something
rebuild?
like what could be returned to it or done to improve it?
So our heroes are essentially on a quest of restoration.
I mean, that definitely makes me, and this is very cliche, so I'm not saying do this, but just as a framework, thinking about the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. Maybe the first place they come to is something like the first stage, which in the Kubler-Ross model would be denial. So no, nothing happened. We're fine. We don't need your help. We don't need you here. You're not wanted. You're not welcome. Again, just the idea of using existing, psychological frameworks around resilience and grief and loss to kind of lay the foundation for how it plays out. Because of course, mental health is not a stage. You don't progress from one nice, neat category to the other. It's back and forth. It's very messy. There is no roadmap. But I think for the purposes of a narrative and carrying people along, it might be helpful to, at least from the mental health perspective, have something underlying and guiding that mission that isn't necessarily the Kubler-Ross stages of grief.
So we're talking about the NPCs, the people of the town, essentially saying, "No, we're good. We can handle this on our own." Okay.
Or what we, something we could also do, because grief isn't a linear process and losing something isn't a linear process, and D&D actually provides a really good way to represent non-linear storytelling, because like dungeon maps, you can travel from one area to another out of order or out of sync, and that would be really interesting to sort of take what most people consider a linear process. Like when people hear about the stages of grief, they go, okay, it's denial, then it's anger, then it's this, then it's that, and they expect that journey. But what if we were able to mix it up and make an open, like a sort of a spider web almost, or like a bubble map, where maybe where you enter isn't necessarily denial, but it's one of the other stages. And then when you move, it doesn't move in a linear fashion, and you end up having to go back into some of the areas as you follow that non-linear trajectory, and sometimes double back as you are trying to help these people, because that's how real life mental health is. It's never one straight path or never a straightforward journey.
So I'm thinking about what Dr. Kelly said in terms of the stages of grief, and also what Makenzie is echoing in the idea that it's not a linear progression. And, some people go through some of them, some people don't go through others. And but what's interesting is I think about the stages of grief in what we talked about thematically, the idea of exhaustion, the idea of emotional outbursts, the idea of a lot of things, and that can be contained within all 5.
Mhm.
And so what if we set this up as a dynamic? We essentially randomize. Roll a d10, you encounter an NPC who manifests one of these stages.
Yeah. I like it.
Krystina
Flexibility.
has a thinking face on.
I think can you hear me? I just want to make sure I'm not talking at the air. Yeah?
Oh,
No?
Almost.
Hmm? Can you hear me now?
yes.
Yes.
All right, that's frustrating. So I think just going into it, we have to kind of acknowledge the fact that some people already work through kind of those things in game. Just for example, we were told on an adventure that we were going on vacation. And my character was extremely excited to finally get a break. They'd just come out of Avernus and everything felt like it was falling apart. So all of a sudden, people start showing up needing help. There's all these people showing up needing help. And she says no. She's like, why don't we just go on vacation? And finally, at one point, just breaks down because that one change to the routine just ruined everything, because these people are expected to go and to heal towns all the time and save people and fight dragons and then just move on to the next. And that in itself is traumatic. Our people that are fighting these battles, our characters are stuck in kind of like 2020. They're stuck in this constant trauma spiral that they can't get off of. And now you're going to couple that with, we've just walked into someone else dealing with their trauma and we need to fix theirs. So what happens to ours in the process?
Mm-hmm.
So
are we healing through it?
Are we talking about current therapists? It sounds really familiar.
So how do we manifest this in a 3-hour adventure? Now, this is the fact that everybody is sort of hemming and hawing, I think represents something that we should make clear to the audience. It's not easy to do emotionally intensive stories well. Yeah. It's easy to rely on stereotype. It's easy to rely on, oops, trauma is a plot twist, which I know Dr. Kelly absolutely detests. So taking this idea that our heroes are coming to a town to basically help clean up the mess. Mm-hmm. Maybe our heroes are emotionally drained as well. How do we manifest this as a plot?
If we're talking D&D, I think this feels like a lower level adventure, because at lower levels, characters have less that they can really do dramatically. They can't teleport places. They can't heal people to the same extent. And I think that's important here, because it's understanding there's only so much that we can do sometimes, or there's only so much help we think we can do. And it doesn't mean we have to stop there, but nothing is, like everyone was saying, nothing is a single fix. Nothing is a quick fix. This is a long-term process that is going to take helping and healing and introducing to the characters possibilities of what they can do to help. And if they cannot help, the frustrating acknowledgement.
Okay, so then maybe this isn't a 3-hour one-shot. Maybe this is the structure for an entire campaign.
I think so.
Okay.
I think in a way, not to dismiss what you can do in 3 to 4 hours, but thematically and personally, that's gonna be a draining game. You're gonna, I think we have to think about the effects of this on your person after that's done, even in the context of like, yeah, we're helping these people, but like I've personally healed through this game. I know people who I very much advocate for how healing D&D can be. So I guess what we run into is, how do we tell this story without making it just a story? Like, how do we do it in a way that doesn't make people feel like their issues are just a plot point? Like, how do we convey that? And I think that that's the slope that you have to get up before you get into this, because it's kind of like you're watching someone work through your stuff, and it's very personal, and it can be like, of course, that's why you have safeguards in place. That's why you have your cards, your X's, your yellows, your reds, your greens, like your system of boundaries in place. Like, those things are important. But like, that's going to be a hefty session 0 to get just past that point of, how does this make you feel? And I think in putting it into the NPC, like, it does feel like it's like in Jumanji when there's the guy and he comes and he's like, I'm Nigel, and you get in the car and it's like, could you imagine that dude that's like, I'm depressed? Like, that's how, like, you have to avoid that feeling of this guy, like having that NPC. Not to say that your storyteller is not capable of creating a nuanced, emotional person that you can talk to and play off, but like, how do you do, like, not everyone can be trusted with that kind of material as a storyteller. Like, that's it's a very, like, I just want to be honest about it. I think it's a very slippery slope of, it's like, I wouldn't sit down at the table with somebody who's never experienced racism and have them like want me to work through this thing that they don't fully understand. So I think that's kind of like I'm sure it's a specialized group of people that are like, how do I run this adventure, and like, we can help each other, can work through this. Like, how do we keep it from becoming more of a weapon, I guess? Sorry, I just have to.
That's a real, no, you're raising a lot of really good points here, and that's something we haven't discussed, is what kind of tone of game are we really running here? Are we running something that's really are we running something that is kind of almost psychological exploration in really deep and dark ways? Are we doing this in a sort of high fantasy, lighthearted adventure kind of ways? Like, and it almost sounds like that may be a better way to go to keep things relatively lighthearted.
I mean, I think it depends on the purpose. And this is going to change based on whoever's DMing, is that you can do like, hey, here's depression. Here it is, but typically when people are confronted with stuff like that, they put their guards up and they're not going to do as deep exploration as they would if there was a more, a more fantasy element to it, or a more abstract element to it. The less threatened we feel, the fewer defenses we put up. And so for a lot of us who have either used D&D for ourselves for our own exploration, or like I use it with my my therapy groups for my kiddos, the fact that they get to go somewhere else and be someone else allows them to do really intense personal work that would be incredibly threatening and overwhelming for them if I just sat them down and like, okay, let's talk about what happened. And so to Krystina's point, absolutely. And to Gabe, to everybody's point, like, yes, this is really hard. Because you don't want to try and simplify it down to just one thing. And I mean, I guess in terms of like, for me, I was thinking, and this is just my preconceived notion of, okay, this is a 3-hour adventure. Maybe it's like my character building. Maybe this is me fleshing out my backstory. And, it's the post-Power Rangers scene where we're cleaning up Angel Grove. And I'm thinking about like, what brought my character here to this tavern? And then all the people around me also, and maybe the whole thing takes place in the tavern, and with us telling our own stories and figuring out like, well, where were you when that happened? And kind of building that together so that no one is trying to prescribe, this is sexism, this is racism, this is whatever ism, but rather you bringing yourself and what you want to work on to the table. And it's not an NPC that's carrying depression. It's not an NPC that's carrying anxiety, but it's yourself and what you want to bring to the table. And then whatever adventure comes after, great. But, thinking about having that kind of deep well of character, I don't know, that's really exciting to me. And it doesn't feel as scary or as like trope laden.
So essentially, if I hear what you're saying, just essentially you're talking to the people in the tavern. You're just having random conversations with people after a great calamity.
Maybe. And the players too. So not just the innkeeper or whatever, but my fellow players. Like, well, where, I was on the front line of Riga. Where were you when whatever fell? And figuring out, maybe you are I can't even talk, I'm so excited. You are figuring out and collaborating on what that catastrophe was, and then how it impacted each of you individually, and then that impacts how you work together going forward on whatever dragon slaying adventure comes next.
So you're leaving it up to the players to tell their own stories.
I'm a therapist, I can't help it.
I think that would work for a one shot. If the DM has the conversation with their players and they all understand and agree and know going into that what this session will be. Mm-hmm. And if this is an aftermath of something chaotic and the players at the table wanted to be involved in this and they wanted to go into this, and the DM sits and talks with them and asks them if they have an idea for an NPC to be in this story, if they have an idea for a character they would want to include, if they have an approach that they would want. And then when the circumstance comes to it, instead of the DM being the person to do that, the player takes over that other character that the party interacts with. So if you're in the tavern having that conversation and they're speaking to each other, when the party comes to that character that is working through something or resolving something, if the player has that emotion or that feeling, instead of the DM speaking for them, it gives that player the opportunity to speak up themselves. But in a safer format where it's sometimes nice to not have to be yourself when you want to express yourself. And that's why like the communication is so important of it.
Right. No, so, I mean, I think everybody here will advocate for session zero. Do them every time you're doing a campaign. Yeah. They are important to establish limitations. And there's lots of great resources out there for that. But being cognizant of the time here, what do we want the goal for this adventure to be, where we're coming into the ruined town in the aftermath of a great calamity?
I think if anything, it should be healing. Like if that's something we're going to do, like to go on an adventure that is solely focused on not preparing to fight a big bad, not doing anything, but having a session that is solely focused on healing for your characters, to give them space to work out different things. And again, like this goes back to, as Satine kind of sets it up, like sitting down and talking about it. I'll be personal for a moment. I had a really bad day. It was the anniversary of my best friend's death, and I didn't want to play. But I had an obligation to show up and to be there, and I just was not emotionally prepared to do what I had to do. And what my dungeon master did was she set up a space for me to kind of paint the picture myself. She played off of it, she received it, but to be able to do it behind the mask of my character, to work through what I was dealing with, and like to not like it wasn't like I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna leave here and I'm not gonna be sad anymore, but to just have a space to talk and to work through things, even if it's not your personal thing. If your character has been going through something, like just creating a space to be able to cry, scream, say how you feel, do whatever. And I think just not being so rigid around it, just creating a space. So much of this is just creating a space so that someone feels heard. And like that, I think that's how you avoid kind of running into the trope situation, is just what do you need to work through and how can I be of assistance? How can I create a safe space for you to process what you need to process, be it as your character or as your person behind that mask of your character?
So I'm thinking about how to manifest this, and that we keep coming back to this idea of just letting your player characters explore their own emotional needs within the realm of this aftermath. So this is going to be, if somebody were to run this is going to be a very intensely emotional adventure that I think isn't going to, I think we're getting to the point where we can just basically throw out the typical story structure at this point.
Yeah. That
this is an intense exploration of the characters and the aftermath. So this is not going to necessarily be for everybody, this kind of adventure, but for the people who want to do this sort of deep character exploration, this could be really fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, when you asked the question of what the goal is, the first thing that popped into my head was to take a breath. I know when I'm playing, and I'm sure my friends hate me for it, but I'm like, guys, I just got trampled by a triceratops. I'm going to need a minute. I'm not jumping into the next adventure. My character needs to take a breath for a second and process that I had to do saving throws and stuff. And I don't see that happening very much in games. And so for me, the idea of, okay, this is at least a one shot that's all about just taking a moment to take a breath and to reflect on the thing that your character has been through. Maybe that was the giant, big post-apocalyptic thing, which many campaigns have and would make a lot of sense. Maybe it was the destruction of the popcorn factory and now the streets are flooded with popcorn kernels. Like, you can really do whatever you want with it. It doesn't have to inherently be something like super meaty or traumatic, but it is a moment to think about, okay, what just happened? How does my player feel about that? What are they thinking about that? And what are the lasting impacts of that? And what work do I need to do before I'd be ready to, grab my sword and go out again?
Yeah.
So maybe that's exactly where we leave this. This is essentially each player getting the opportunity to tell their story, to relate to each other, either around a campfire or around in the pub of a ruined city. What do we all think of this?
I like it. I think it's a good role-playing opportunity. It's probably a good bonding opportunity, and it's an opportunity for the player and the character to be as open and vulnerable as they want to and feel up to.
Mm-hmm. And that does a lot of what everybody here really is talking about, and that's leaving this up to the player agency and really not trying to railroad any sort of heavy-handed topics onto each individual player. That's because I don't think any player really likes being railroaded. I know I certainly don't. So what do we think? What's the resolution of some of these things? Is there even a resolution to this? Is there a concrete resolution the same way we would have, like, you've defeated the big baddie?
No. I don't believe there can be, because that's the number one thing is mental health is a continuing battle. It's an ongoing journey. It's a dragon you're always going to be fighting. So I think there can be a bit of peace, but I don't think there's a resolution.
Okay.
I think... Oh, go ahead.
No, go.
I think when it comes to, like we mentioned earlier, like in the aftermath of a situation, whether it's a really like emotional, serious one or not, there is that want to return to normalcy, to go back to how it was. And I think if there would be a resolution, it's that acceptance that it can't go back to the way it is, that the solution isn't to go back or be okay, like or figure out how to be okay again like you were in the past, but just accepting this is the reality now, this is what we are in. We can't go back, but we can slowly start to rebuild, and that acknowledgement that, this is moving on, not fixing anything, not defeating anything definitively, but knowing and taking that first step towards moving forward, I think.
I just had a thought, and I want to throw this out there to all of you. what if we essentially create the idea for a campaign structure that operates similarly to I don't know, like Chaucer's Tales, where as we, the group, are journeying back towards where we came from, we're telling stories of what has happened along the way, and it becomes an episodic thing that has led up to the characters as now.
I like it.
Would that presuppose that someone had already had to go on a quest and is on their way back?
It does. So we're throwing that at.
No, I was just wondering, again, as someone who is relatively new, I only have 1 or 2 adventures under my belt, and they're all in one direction, and I don't think I would be able to, if it required me to go back.
Okay.
I don't think I would be in a place where I could use that, and that's okay. Like, that's totally fine. Not everything is for everybody, and I would get there eventually. But yeah, I was just wondering if this was something where the story would ride out, and so you're discovering your past as you're revisiting it, or if it was, which is fine. But I really do like the idea to go back and reflect, like, hey, remember that time we did that really ridiculous thing and somehow it worked, or somehow you like completely failed at it. So both as the character and for the players, that might be really refreshing.
What do the rest of y'all think?
I think it sounds like the kind of adventure and experience that happens after a long campaign.
Okay, so that's too much too quickly.
I think that's a good thing, because if they have something after that long campaign, it's something to continue the characters and the story if they want to, but in a way that, if everyone's comfortable and agrees to it, can be cathartic.
Okay. So if I'm hearing everybody correctly, what we would really need to do to set up this story, if we were to run this just as everybody let's go back to the whole campfire idea or township idea. They come into the ruined town. What we really need to do is we need to set up just the background of what happened to the town. No, we're not going to do that. This is very open-ended.
Yeah. And I think that's the structure.
Mental health.
Yeah, that's the structure that works. There's never a single answer, but there are different choices that we make, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't, but we still try.
Okay.
Yeah, there's not an end, but there are like checkpoints or check-in points along the way.
How are we going to, so if we were to write this down, how are we going to structure this? How are we going to instruct people to do something like this? And this is where I'm looking at the game designers and writers in this group. We're pointing left and right, pointing left and right.
I think the way that a way that I've seen it done, and that I think is probably one of the healthier ways to do it, is to know each character has someone they're dealing with going in. Like it's not necessarily a group conversation. You're not laying bare your trauma in front of your entire crew, like doing it more in a one-on-one kind of way, where each player, it's not about trying to one-up each other or show each other up at the table. It is a one-on-one conversation where each person gets to deal with what they're dealing with. Does that make sense? Like, it has to be like, I think it's just easier to do in a situation where, like, it's not performing, it's intimate. Like, it needs to be something like a more intimate setting in a game.
Can you give an example?
Say your DM is coming in as a person that you knew from your past, and it's of course a ghost of someone from your past, but they're talking to you, they're asking you about something. Like, maybe you lost someone from your party, or like one of your NPCs that was helping you fight in a battle, in your last battle, and that person appears to you and you're telling them what you never got to say, or just different kind of one-on-one scenarios. Like, even if it has to be like a dream sequence where everyone is taking this long rest and they meet someone that they need to deal with or talk to.
Okay.
I really love the idea of looking into what actually happens during a long rest. You know, what is going on during that period where all of your magic comes back and all of your healing spells are back and whatever. Like I know right now, it's magic. But yeah, to Krystina's point of, what a dream sequence where you confront whatever you need to confront based on what the player wants to look at. And it may be deep and it may not. And I think that flexibility is really important because obviously it's got to be a choice. And you are going to need their active consent to do it.
So, okay. This is sounding less and less like a full scripted out adventure. More and more like just setting a scene. That sound about right for everybody?
I think the whole point of it in a roundabout kind of way is that mental health isn't a game. It's a process.
Okay.
And it's its own adventure, like that part of yourself, of your brain, of your healing. And I'm sure there is a way to do it that I hope would take lots and lots of professionals and guidelines. But I think that's one of the important things is I don't think it's something that can be solved in a 45-minute panel. I think it's something that is a process, like mental health itself. It is all a process. And I think that that's the reality of trying to do a brainstorm situation such as this, is to be able to acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
My 2 cents.
So then how do we set up the scene? If we can only give the setup for a DM to use for their players to explore this, what do we do? The characters simply approach a ruined town, seeing the smoking remains of some disaster. We don't know what. They walk into the town. Everybody seems to be funneling themselves towards the local pub, the local library, the local square, help me out here, people.
Or you fall into a sleep. You fall into a sleep and each person deals with that in a dream. And that's one way that you can do it, because everyone's dream would be different.
Okay.
So you find yourselves in a dreamscape, trying to find your way back to your people. And on the way, those are the things that you have to confront. You aren't actually confronting a dragon to get back to them. You're confronting things that you've been running from, and whatever form that may come in, of a person, of a place. And you kind of, in your story of your character, what place you've been that you still are scarred from or haven't healed from. So working with your DM to be like, oh, well, we'll run into Hector, who I lost in this situation. But you find yourself waking up and you're back on the front lines with him, or you're in a place with him trying to get to him or to talk to him or something, like whatever you need to do to mend that relationship or to get that closure.
So if we're going to charge every DM to do this, we are going to essentially ask them to go to each one of their players and ask each individual player, what is your character's need? What is your character's regret? What is your character's... So this is going to require some individualized setup with each player before we run into this. And it sounds like we're really liking this idea of falling into the dream, resting before getting to the town. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah.
I'm still on the idea of a campfire, because as soon as you said campfire, I thought of s'mores, and it just sounded really good. And also, if it's a situation where people can opt out, Because that would always be my want and my concern is, okay, this is what we're doing. And then who here wants to fall asleep with the understanding that, near all this noxious fumes of the burnt town, there may be weird dreams. And if you don't want to, guess what? You can stand watch and you don't have to necessarily engage in this dream state. But obviously that could be done anywhere. I just really like s'mores.
But one of the things we're also talking about here is, and I want to be really clear on this, we're not talking about choosing your player and having them just portray some mental health condition. Really, what we're talking about is exploring an individual player's needs and a regret. We're not talking about, hey, I've decided that my character has, let's say, schizophrenia, when you don't know anything about schizophrenia and you just go with a stereotype. We're talking about exploring emotional needs.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And you can even stick to more universal human experiences like love or loss. Not everybody has experienced depression, but everybody has experienced loss of something, or, love. Hopefully, pretty much everyone has experienced love at some point. However it may manifest for them. Everyone has faced challenges that they've had a really hard time with and had to overcome. So even just kind of like taking a step back and not trying to necessarily, like you said, pinpoint it on a specific disorder or a specific mental health thing, but there are general human conditions that we all struggle with. And so if someone wants to project their depression onto that, great, and they want to go there. Or it could be something much more superficial, just based on where the person is comfortable with.
Okay. So we're talking about, so this is less of a manualized adventure. And this is more of a series of aspirational instructions to a player group. That this is something where we are gonna want to go to each of our players, ask each of our players, what is your individual need? Like, what does your player want? What does your character want? What does your character desire? What does your character miss?
Yeah.
Are those good
what
questions?
I think does a really good job of this, and this is an excuse for me to hype up one of my other panelists. Gabe, your class modifier thing with all those narrative questions does a really good job of providing that sort of prompting questions that can help a DM and a player work out what a character is and what a character wants to do.
That makes sense. Yeah. So I think this is the kind of thing that almost goes with an adventure, depending on how they feel, depending on what they want to talk about, what they want to delve into. You give the DM choices and options that if that player wants to delve into that stuff for themselves and with their character, then here are ways to go into it. And I almost feel like it makes it a little more fluid, because then they don't have to go through the entire steps. They can go as far as they feel comfortable while still having this adventure that they're going on alongside it, or if this is after the adventure, because then it also it's a stopping point wherever they want to stop, instead of they have to follow through the adventure or else it falls out.
And I think that does a really good job of supporting this idea that mental health and mental illness are not the same thing. And then you can have bad mental health, but not have a mental illness. You can just be super, super stressed, but that doesn't mean necessarily that you have a mental disorder. But you could probably use some help with, your mental wellness. And so I would always, be hesitant of like, okay, let's use this to dive into depression in like a prescribed way, because that makes my therapist senses tingle a little bit, and I'm not sure about it. But in cases where that's what you are opting into as a player, where you feel safe with your DM, you feel safe with your players, you feel safe enough with yourself to go there, then I think that should be on the table. But absolutely, like Gabe said, it should not be required to cross the finish line, so to speak.
Okay. So, I'm really happy with the direction this has gone in. This panel has gone completely differently than I expected it to go, and that is so fantastic because, well, first of all, let's talk about an analogy for tabletop role-playing games right there. my panelists have taken this in a very different but extremely valuable direction. That this sort of exploration of needs, not even a portrayal of a diagnosis, this sort of exploration of needs may not be for everybody. Maybe you want to be with a group that's more of a hack and slash thing, and that's fine. But if you want to do something like this, and you're a DM out there who wants to do something like this is going to require some care and attention and some forethought on your part to explore with your players what do they want as players about what their characters need. Is that a reasonable summary of what y'all have been saying?
That feels right.
Is there anything I'm missing from that summary? Krystina's got her thinking face on again.
It's just my, like, you can set, like, boundaries are important, and knowing, like, it just makes me feel some type of way to it being mishandled and, like,
yes,
and misinterpreted. So I just think it's important to kind of let your player guide and do what they are comfortable with. Like, you can't force someone to be emotional. You can't force someone to deal with those kinds of things, which is, of course, why there's an agreement going forward. But I just think it's a larger conversation. And I think this is but I think where we're at is, whatever you do, be mindful of the hearts and minds that are at your table. Always make sure that you are making people comfortable, that you are not crossing any lines. Make sure you have your boundary, you have that very honest conversation about, this is a hard line no for me, and you stand by that, because your boundaries are important. That is your boundary. People respect it. If they don't respect it, then they do not respect you. So do not put yourself in that situation. Don't go into this with a you don't know and don't trust. And I think this is something that you get into maybe later, where you know each other, you've established a rapport. But I think that the most important before I walk away from this table is to say, be safe and be mindful.
You know what? I was going to say some stuff like that, but I wouldn't have said it nearly as well as Krystina just said it. That was absolutely fantastic. Does anybody else want to give their last thoughts? I love to give my panelists the last thoughts. We are about to wrap up. Let's give Krystina. What's that?
I said, sorry. No, if Krystina had the last one, I'm sorry. I was just going to say thank you to Raph for, letting us take this where we needed it to go, because I feel like that's going to be something that's needed for any DM who would run this kind of game, is being very responsive and empathic and aware about, it's not even just not being on rails. It's about being actively listening and responsive and empathic with your players.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you very much for that. Well, it looks like we are pretty much out of time now. Well, thank you everybody for being here. And I've been watching the chat. Thank you all in the chat. There's been a lot of really vivacious, active discussion going on. This is obviously a complex topic that we can't tackle definitively in 1 hour. But thank you all for your interest. Thank you all for being here. And please make sure to follow all of these wonderful people on social media and enjoy the rest of D&D Celebration 2020.